Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. We've got a wonderful election ahead of us because everybody believes that anything other than who we have now is going to be better. Well, I don't know if that's so necessarily true, but today we're going to be exploring that as we have author of a new book or a relatively new book that's out there, The Madness of George W. Bush. And joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is local author Paul Levy. And Paul, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Yeah, I'm just really happy to be here with you, Daniel. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I was reading through your book, and I know you even said in there, bear with me in the repetition, but somehow this will all kind of gel together. And I found it kind of interesting that the contention is that we sort of dreamed in, if you will, George W. Bush, but this actually happened a long time ago. Now, kind of describe to our listeners what that means.
Well, okay, what I did in the book, I just took seriously what every spiritual tradition has been saying, and that is that we're having like this mass shared dream. Mm-hmm. And from that point of view, we have dreamed up President Bush into materialization as the supposed, commander-in-chief, as a reflection, an embodied reflection of the absolutely mad, ignorant part of ourselves. So the point is that he's not separate from us, that he's actually a figure that exists in the collective unconscious of all of us. Okay, and so that's in really simple terms what the book is about. That if we concretize him, think of him as sort of separate from ourselves, then we're actually feeding into the underlying pathology. Because in the book, I've actually given a diagnosis of what the deeper process is, and I've given a name to the deeper pathology that's unfolding through the figure of George Bush, and it's actually showing us something really important about ourselves that can potentially wake us up.
Mm-hmm. Now, and again, too, as people would try to understand, they think that this is one of them symptomatic things that has just occurred with just this 8-year administration, but when you really go back to the government politic, it's actually been going on for quite a long time, and you can see totally where we have that responsibility to acknowledge that.
Right. It's not like the thing for me, I first got really triggered by George Bush because he just touched something so deep in me, but what he's a symptom of has been going on in the greater body politic, really since time immemorial. It's something that exists. It's a darkness. It's a shadow element that exists in the soul of all of our species, so to speak. And so it's been unfolding all throughout time. But it just became, it sort of crystallized in such an acute, obvious form in the figure of George Bush and it was because of that I wrote my book, because it was the way I was keeping myself sane. And in the process of doing that, I actually discovered, wow, there's actually this deeper, sort of process that actually is becoming visible through what's playing out in the greater body politic and through the figure of George Bush.
Now, it's interesting because, and I'll kind of quote from your book here about impeachment, because a lot of people think kicking him out of office is going to be good. Mm-hmm. Recently, we just received a book from Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecuting attorney for Charles Manson, which was the persecution of George W. Bush for murder. And I've kind of laid that out to people, what do you think about this? And oh boy, I'd just love to see that happen. And I think to myself, okay, now examine inside of you what stirs you to want to go to that level, that there's even the possibility, and I'm sure many people have entertained this around the world, of even killing him. But trying to, as you say, trying to take a look inside of yourself, which gets you thinking this way. Now, here's the quote from the book that I was specifically looking at. Impeaching Bush and company ultimately won't change anything unless we deal with the corrupt powers which control and direct them. Mm-hmm. George Bush is just a finger puppet of the hidden hand which animates him. Bush only has apparent power, as he himself is a minion of far more powerful predator-like forces whose nefarious interests he serves. Now, I remember as I was reading also, it was a book called Brothers, as well as The Enemy Within, one written by Bobby Kennedy, and then also the other one was about JFK and Bobby Kennedy. And it seems, now we're going back to the 60s, that it was even during their administration and even before then that we were seeing exactly what you're talking about here. So how does one kind of come to grips with this and then kind of move forward so maybe this could change?
Yeah. Well, that's. I mean, I hate to say it, but in this book, it's a groundbreaking book. I talk about exactly that. I talk about that what's playing out, the origin of all the evil that's playing out is in the psyche, is in the human psyche. That's the source of it, and that this pathology that I've diagnosed, that I call malignant egophrenia, that George Bush is actually kind of embodying, but it's an illness. It's a pathology that exists deep in the soul of our species, that if we have the recognition of that, the only way to see that, because it's it's so hard to diagnose because we all have it in potential, and a person can seem very normal and very, just charismatic or whatever. But once we recognize the disease, that actually it's like this non-local disease, which means that's a physics term, which means it transcends third-dimensional space and time, which means it can manifest anywhere at any moment in potential. To see the nature of this, like it's like a higher dimensional virus, is to have an expansion of consciousness. And the only solution, and I would debate anyone on this, the only solution to what's happening, in the greater body politic of our world is to have an expansion of consciousness. So this disease that Bush is actually the revelation of, malignant egophrenia, encoded in the disease is a revelation, is waking us up. That's what I'm pointing at. And only if enough of us have the recognition, and it's exactly like being in a dream and having the recognition of the nature of our situation, i.e. that we're dreaming, when enough people in that dream connect with each other and put their realization together of what they're discovering, they can actually change the dream. And that's it's like an evolutionary impulse that's being offered to us by the universe, and it all depends if we recognize what's being revealed.
Very well said, too, and you also brought up the ideal of physics in your book, and a lot of people this day and age, they've been clinging to movies such as The Secret or What the Bleep Do We Know, and they see, or at least they feel or sense the possibility that a powerful way of intention can move us in a different direction. However, you start getting caught up in your day-to-day life and you realize, well, you kind of thought your way or intended your way to this existence that you have now. How do you expect to even elevate that same power of thought or intention to the level where things do shift in such a way that we have a more peaceful world when we have leaders from countries all over the world? It's not just the United States, although we seem to be the most lauded to have this sort of evil leadership, so to speak. And you wonder, just like any individual, they see a solution to the problem, but they think, but there's just me. And physics demands that it follows its own action.
Sure. Well, the thing is, there's a couple things. First off, the only way that any real change can happen is through transformation in the individual. So, for any one of us actually seeing the deeper process, actually having the recognition of what I'm talking about, for example, a beautiful metaphor that Jung talks about as far as the formation of symbols in the unconscious. He says it's like when you add grains of sugar into water and they just dissolve and dissolve and dissolve. And once the water reaches a saturation point, you add one more grain of sugar and a crystal just instantaneously appears. And to make that metaphor more to a personal level, any one of us at any moment having the recognition of the deeper process that's happening, of actually seeing malignant egophrenia, or having the recognition of all of this is a reflection, that we're dreaming, however you say it, that could be the grain of sugar that precipitates an expansion of consciousness in the collective unconscious of our species itself. So any one of us waking up instantaneous, non-locally, affects the entire world. That's one thing. The second thing, in physics, they talk about what is the nature of light. Is it a wave or is it a particle? And they did these experiments and they came to the realization, it depends how we observe it. And that's just like a dream. where the dream is a function of the observing consciousness. The dream is a reflection of the very consciousness that's observing it. It's not separate from that. So the point is, going back to George Bush, is he the incarnation of like the Antichrist? And I talk about this in my book. Or is he the highest level bodhisattva? And it depends how we dream it, where he can actually be the agent that's destroying the biosphere and the entire planet. Or he can be the figure in our waking dream that actually wakes us up, and it all depends on us.
Right. Very well said, actually, because, as you said, and people should come to understand during this show that, we don't tend to get political, but we try to show different points of view, because it's amazing that when you take a look at the political process, why people believe in such a way that they will vote a particular way, and then there's an outcome, of course, that never seems to satisfy everybody. But then you think of that dissatisfaction that you feel. For instance, you might ask the question, what can't you stand about George W. Bush? And pay attention to that sort of emotional response that you have. It isn't so much what you say, but it's what you're feeling. Mm-hmm. And in understanding that, you're simply also saying or suggesting in your book, The Madness of George W. Bush, is that will be the key thing that you should be learning about yourself. That's the mirror within yourself. Totally. When you can change that, then you begin to change the outside outcome, because of just that one simple thing. You see yourself, and therefore it's up to you to change yourself, and that changes the outcome.
Right. And the thing is, because that's one of the main things in my book that I talk about, that what's playing out in the outer world is a reflection of our inner process, and that's just like a dream. So like with George Bush, when he became president, he so freaked me out and so triggered something inside of me. And what I did, I went inside, and I was like, well, what's that in me that's being touched? And that was how the book came out. But then what I'm pointing at is that as, we each kind of go inwards and really find what it is in us that's being triggered and actually metabolize that has a very direct effect on the entire field of consciousness. Because getting back to this disease, this psychospiritual disease of the soul that I've diagnosed called malignant egophrenia, it's a field phenomena. It can't be understood when you see each of us as being separate selves. Like, it's very different than when you see somebody and you go, oh, he's a bipolar person or a schizophrenia or something like that. No. Because that's still seeing the person as isolated from the surrounding field, and that's an illusion. We're all interconnected and interdependent and not separate from the whole universe. And so when you begin to see that, you begin to see, oh, this sort of higher dimensional, pathology, malignant egophrenia, it's enfolded throughout the entire field of consciousness. And at any moment, it's actually manifesting in each one of us to the extent we're asleep. But Bush, being so possessed by his unconscious and being so possessed by his shadow, he's actually incarnating that very pathology. So he's the revelation. He's showing us something, about this very pathology. And the whole basis of the pathology is being split off from his own darkness. So because he's split off from his own shadow, he's then projecting it out there onto whoever, the terrorist or whatever, and then trying to destroy them, which itself is a reflection of his inner process of trying to destroy his own darkness. But by doing that, he becomes possessed by the very darkness that he's trying to destroy. And what I'm describing is complete insanity, and that's what he's showing us, and we all have that same potentiality in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Yeah, and so that idea of projecting the shadow outside of us, it's such a profound dynamic that exists in the psyche of our species, and that's actually the underlying psychological process that's playing out in the greater body politic.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense, definitely. And, again, when you suggest to people, just think of the things that perhaps George Bush has done that has really pretty much gotten you to the point you think about strangling him. Mm-hmm. Then ask yourself this question, well, for instance, let's just say that he tends to be somebody who goes out and gets away with whatever it is that he wants to, just kind of makes up the rules as he gets along.
Mm-hmm.
But now think inherently when you're at work and you get frustrated because your boss tells you to do something. In other words, You're challenging the fact that the rules aren't the way that you want them to be and you wished you had that power to change them. This is a way you can look at this now. Now, here's another interesting thing that he keeps being lauded about, and in fact, in Vince's book, he keeps talking about the arrogance of George W. Bush, that he seems to have this arrogance. Yeah, I know I'm doing whatever I want. What are you going to do about it? You know, sort of like an in-your-face sort of thing. Now, for instance, people now perceive that through George W. Bush that America is arrogance, okay, and that could be true. Now, as I was overseas in France, I found it quite interesting that as I was out and about town and I seen some acquaintances, I was in the Navy and they were from the same ship, and they were out in town, and the way they were carrying themselves, there was a sense of arrogance as though French people had never seen Americans before. Now, what's interesting is that the French would say, well, you Americans seem so arrogant, but we still have the same perception of them. So now you can see how this collectively plays out on a world leader that showcases those perceptions that others, as well as ourselves, have about America.
And the thing I just want to say about that is that, you see, the thing about Bush, because being so taken over by this, by malignant egophrenia and just being taken over by his unconscious shadow, he's a symptom of the collective psychosis that our species is suffering from. And the thing which is so interesting, it's so obvious that we've collectively gone mad as a species. I mean, one example being the fact that we're destroying the biosphere, the life support system of our planet, and the fact that no one's even talking about that that there's a psychic epidemic. Like when you study the psychiatrist Carl Jung, he talks about the greatest danger by far facing our species is to fall into a psychic epidemic, is to fall into a collective psychosis. And that's exactly what's happening, and it's so pervasive and so prevalent that no one's even talking about it. So Bush is actually a symptom of this actually underlying collective psychosis that's existing in the collective unconscious of our species. But the point I'm pointing out in the book is that encoded in the pathology, which could potentially destroy us, is its own resolution, that encoded in it is a blessing, and that all that's needed for us is to actually have the recognition of what's being shown to us. The thing which is interesting, the word, when people talk about the apocalypse, etymologically, the word apocalypse means something hidden that's being revealed. These are apocalyptic times, and something is being revealed to us. What's playing out is a revelation. And what's needed is, and the origin of it is the human psyche, and all that's needed is to recognize what's being revealed. And it's just like being in a dream, and you either don't recognize the nature of the situation, in which point you're absorbed in the dream, and you're just creating more karma and reacting to the dream and just perpetuating your unconsciousness, or if you have the recognition of, if this is a dream, this is my own reflection, it's my own energy, it's actually showing me what's happening inside of myself, then you've awakened in the dream, and then your whole relationship to the dream radically changes, and you connect with your true empowerment to change the dream. And what I'm talking about is that when enough people in this waking dream of ours have that recognition and connect with each other, we can activate our collective genius and change the dream, change the waking dream we're having, and that's evolution, and that's what's being offered to us. And this isn't some sort of new age woo-woo stuff. This is actually the fundamental, deeper dreaming process that's being revealed to us. And everything depends on if enough of us recognize it.
For a lot of people, they would take a listen to this show and say, well, that sounds pretty heady. It sounds, as you would suggest, even woo-woo-ish. But really, you get down to the essential level, and even Carl Jung, who I can see you have a lot of respect for in your book, seems to think that, well, okay, I guess this sort of makes sense, but what does this have to do with me? Well, it has a lot to do with just the way you think and feel about the whole world. Now, I'll give you a couple of interesting examples. There was a particular documentary that I've seen. It was about the Dixie Chicks who really got hammered for making a statement that they were ashamed that President Bush was from Texas. So what happens is the same group, and you just have to sort of imagine this for a minute, the same group, we'll just call them Group A, did exactly what Group B did when John Lennon, back in, I believe it was the late 60s, say the kids seem to identify more with us than they do with Jesus Christ. which was a true statement. It wasn't arrogant in its fact. The fact is that the kids of that day and time recognized or identified more with the Beatles than they did with Jesus Christ. There was no arrogance in the statement at all. He was just stating a true social fact. So Group B, and these both groups, A and B, were of the United States. Interestingly enough, and I'm not just trying to pinpoint a social area, but it was more of the south to the southeast, were taking out CDs and records and burning them in protest to these statements. And I thought to myself, what is it that this group A and B seems so doggedly aware of trying to defend themselves against?
Yeah. And the thing of just let me say about that, like the thing about this malignant egophrenia, which is the psychospiritual disease that's actually propagating itself through our species. You see, that would be an example of the people who would be like, breaking the Beatles records and burning the records or the books, which of course, happened in Nazi Germany. The point about malignant egophrenia is that being a field phenomena, it's non-local. So what that means, say you have somebody like George Bush who's embodying the pathology, right? And like, for example, if somebody sees, oh, he's just ignorant, he's crazy, they're not going to support him. But if people don't see that and actually get entranced by his seeming charisma and support Bush and follow him, they become the non-local instruments through which malignant egophrenia then propagates itself. You see, it propagates itself through the field, and it propagates itself through the collective blind spot in the psyche of our species. And that's exactly what happened when you study the Nazis in World War II. A lot of the Germans, they were these normal, good people who thought Hitler was helping them, but by like supporting them or by like actually supporting him or not, resisting him, or by following him thinking he's the Fuhrer who's going to bring them economic prosperity or whatever, they actually became the agents through which malignant egophrenia back then replicated itself through the actual population of Germany. And see, it's incredibly important for us to recognize there's a deeper process that's playing out. It's played out all throughout, history, and it's sort of like the shadow that typically hides in the corners or underground is becoming illuminated and becoming visible. Because what happens when you shine a lot of light is that everything that's not light, all the shadow, becomes visible. So as the darkness in our world seems more and more apparent and more just things seem worse and worse, it's actually a sign, it's actually an expression from the dreaming point of view that the light is nearby, that the light is emerging.
Yeah, it's just incredible to think, and I know that you're now alluding to how Nazi Germany and the Fuhrer and that whole bit was playing out. And I remember that I've really enjoyed documentaries for whatever reason. I think it's so I can probably understand who I am and who we are, probably just because then you're reminded of what we have done in history. And this happened to be a documentary about the day that the war had been declared to an end. We were done with it. This is World War II that I'm talking about. And immediately the British and the BBC went into all of the camps to basically free and set straight anything that had happened in these German concentration camps. And what was incredible, it isn't so much the millions of what would be almost nameless people that had just died due to whether it was disease, sickness, or just outright killed in these concentration camps. But it was the stewards of these camps. They were both German men and women, officers, and, of course, enlisted. And as they were there on this first day, now I'm reminding the audience, these concentration camps, this went on for years before it was, before the war had ended. And it was the looks on their faces as the British went in to these camps as though they didn't see that anything they were doing was wrong. Murdering and people dying, humans suffering to imaginations that nobody could ever even fathom. And, women especially, they look like they were just having tea and, hey, how are you doing? What brings you here? Sort of a thing. And I thought, that's astounding that they are so covered with what they do that they don't see that there's something wrong here.
Yeah, and that's an example of what I'm talking about in the book of like, at the root of malignant egophrenia is this deep disassociation from a part of oneself. And like with that particular example, because I talk about this in my book and in my other work, I've already written my next book after that, hasn't come out yet, is the fact that they created like this double personality that enabled them as doctors say in the concentration camps, to go in and kill people, to select who was going to be killed, and then go home at night and be a good, this loving father or like husband or something like that. And it was like they had so disassociated from a part of themselves, and of course projected out their shadow at that point, whether it was on the Jews or whoever. But what I'm saying is that what they enacted, that's an actual unmediated expression of a process that's happening inside their psyche and inside the human psyche. Okay? So if we want to really understand what's actually happening deep inside of ourselves, we see malignant egophrenia, it actually collapses the boundary between the inner and the outer. It's an inner disease of the soul that actually expresses itself through the medium of the outside world. So if you want to cure this disease, all you have to do is open your eyes and look and see what's happening in the world and realize that it's exactly like a dream, that our inner process is playing out in the outer world, and once we see that, we can change it inside of ourselves and then in the outer world too.
It's just amazing, and to also encourage the listeners out there that as what we're talking about isn't a moment that we're taking our fingers and putting blame anywhere. As soon as you do that, you have to realize there's a source for that reaction.
Yeah, we're blaming. In the book, I say, no, if we're blaming George Bush, then we're actually feeding the disease because we're thinking of him as separate. The only person to blame is ourselves. We're all complicit. We're having a mass shared dream, and we're all dreaming up Bush to actually become our president. So if there's anybody to blame, it's ourselves, and not in the sense of that we should feel guilty, but in the sense that we shouldn't blame anybody outside of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Now, Paul, for those of you just tuning in, we're talking with Paul Levy, author of the book The Madness of George W. Bush, and I think what's really great about a conversation like this is the level of responsibility that needs to happen with each and every one of us, and that's what I think is another symptom, as what you're talking about, that George Bush is a symptom of our collective consciousness. We cover the idea of arrogance. We cover the idea that he just seems to trot along and do whatever it is that he wants to, making up the rules as he goes along, much like a bully on a playground. But now the next thing that's really key, and I thought it was kind of interesting because I love the slew of superhero movies that seem to be hitting the screens, and one particular is Iron Man, and he said something that is the billionaire, I can't remember his name right now, in the movie, but he said something I thought is totally true that's been going on quite a long time. And George W. Bush happens to be one of those that has that light that shows us this, and that is zero accountability for all of our actions. Now, there's a big one. Now, it isn't him, because when you take a look at America when it comes to entertainment, that seems to be the order of the day, that we feel we can just go and do whatever we want. Why should we be accountable for it? Now, see that played out on the grand scale.
Yeah, totally. And you're totally right that the thing with Bush, I mean, he can say the words, I'm taking responsibility, but, it's clear he's not taking accountability for anything. But just to remember, it's easy to get fascinated with Bush, and that's the point of, like, the darker powers, that he's just a puppet on a string, but he's sort of like, this symbol. And the word symbol, you see, what is the language of dreams? But they speak in symbols, and symbol, actually the antonym of a symbol is, the word symbolic, the antonym of that is diabolic, and diabolic has to do with that which creates division and separation, where symbolic brings together. So when we see that Bush is just a figurehead, he's a symbol of the deeper pathology, of the deeper evil that's animating, through the powers that be. When we see that he's just symbolic, and that the whole world is an oracle that's speaking symbolically, that's to wake up to the dreamlike nature. That's to have the expansion of consciousness, and that's the very point of view that cures malignant egophrenia. So when enough of us have that, we can actually change the world.
Now, it seems that we have identified, at least hopefully, by putting our finger on what we believe the problem is. And again, as we've been suggesting throughout the Beyond 50 radio program, that George Bush isn't the problem. It's the fact that we collectively have dreamed up this situation for ourselves. Now, we're in an interesting election time, because for the first time in the history of America, a black man is actually running for the leadership of the top office slot of the President of the United States. But then you have what seems to be the typical white sort of candidate that represents those things that some people might believe, or many people might believe, to be the original symptom that got us to here, and that's the white guy that seems to be in power and wield his power the way that he wants to. Mm-hmm. Not to mention that we also have the potentiality of Hillary Clinton stepping up to and being the first woman even to run for the office. So does this suggest that perhaps there's a shift happening here? What is your opinion about that?
Yeah. No, I absolutely see that as an expression that definitely stuff is whatever, just in the consciousness of our species that there is real positive stuff happening. And that's why in the last chapter of my book, it's called Art Happening, called Global Awakening. And it's basically saying that we are artists. We're multidimensional artists whose canvas is this universe. And we can actually, when we have that realization, so for example, like Obama or whatever, he's an expression from one point of view of that we are having that expansion of consciousness, that heart opening, and that as artists we can actually create the art happening called Global Awakening and actually heal our planet and heal ourselves. And I have to stress, that's not New Age woo-woo. That's radically based in cutting-edge physics, in every spiritual wisdom tradition that's ever been on the history of this planet. Mm-hmm. And I just really want to make that clear, that if people are like thinking, oh, this guy is some sort of nutcase, I would take a look at that in themselves, because everything I'm saying is grounded in the deepest wisdom traditions throughout our history.
Mm-hmm. Because once we simply have peace, that's where the most wonderful parts of our creative ability actually begin to express themselves through art and music and creation. And it's quite an interesting way to be living versus being in survival, doing the mundane routine things of going out to gather the nuts, the fruits, and the vegetables, so that way we can feel comfortable at night after we've been fed. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you like to be doing more than that? Now, what do you think we might possibly be seeing here over the next 4 years, or maybe over the next 8 years, regardless of who gets into office, as far as the collective consciousness is concerned? Because you see how things are beginning to ebb and tide. Oil prices skyrocketing through the roof, but yet people are starting to understand their own personal power. Well, if I stop driving my car for a little bit and find alternative ways besides burning up fossil fuels, there really isn't a whole lot this high and mighty powerful oil organization can do about something like that. And again, it gets down to one individual personal choice, and as you said earlier in the show, it ripple effects into a lot of people taking personal responsibility for their actions. Therefore, there is nothing other than the outcome changing itself, and that is in the laws of physics.
Mm-hmm, totally. And like, just one thing I point out in the book is like the macrocosm is a reflection of the microcosm, which is to say that what's happening collectively is a reflection of what's happening inside the individual, and so when there's just individually, when there's a time of great change, things disintegrate. And that can seem really problematic and like a time of great turmoil and chaos, but actually from the higher dimensional point of view, something deeper, some deeper wholeness is actually emerging. And so it's a disintegration towards a higher transformation and integration. And that's, when you study just individual people, you see that process happening, And what I'm saying is that actually is an expression of what's happening collectively. And just one thing you said about the creative, you see, because the dark, the evil powers, the shadow, are more and more playing out and becoming visible. Well, interestingly, when you study the word, it's called daimonic. The daimonic is like this archetypal transpersonal energy. It's not just personal, that can possess a person or a species and act itself out. And if it's channeled unconsciously, it becomes destructive and demonic. But encoded in the daimonic is the highest creative energy. And so as alchemists, it's like we have to actually access that energy which is being channeled through us potentially in a destructive way, whether it be individually or as a species, and actually express it and channel it in a way that's actually productive. So the point is that accessing our creative genius, which has to do with, I actually just wrote an article called The Artist as the Healer of the World, because the figure of the artist is the person who's going to heal our planet. And, and it all has to do with the genius that's locked up in, and then the word genius is interesting because it's related to the word daimon, which literally means the guiding spirit or the inner voice. That when we connect with that daimon consciously, we find our genius, we find our calling, we find our vocation, and we can actually heal ourselves and then be an agent, like this bodhisattvic agent of positive change in the world.
Well, it's also exciting to think to the fact that you can actually have a conversation like this about a leader that seems to have really gotten under everybody's skin for the most part, except for those who believe and with all their hearts that this person has been doing the right thing all along, and to realize that even though we recognize evil as evil, even as in the Tao Te Ching, it simply states, then you also recognize its opposite, where you have to see and know that good is good. And there it is right there in a nutshell. To know that evil is evil, you have to know that good is good. And as you said earlier, it all depends on the alchemist or the observer. But you also have to realize, too, that that's within inside of yourself, and that once you recognize that evil, that once you shine that light on it, which created it in the first place, you realize that it doesn't have the kind of power that you once perceived it to have, and therefore
Absolutely.
You change everything.
Yeah. Can I just say something about that? Because that's
Sure.
a really important point, and that is because in the book I over and over talk about evil and about the importance of actually shedding light on it. Because when you think about it, just like in like with mythology, one of the important things about if there's a demon, once you find its name, you take away its power. And to find its name is to see it, is to objectify it. And the thing about evil is that it's also like it's this non-local energy, and what I'm meaning by that is, say we see in Bush, and he's like being an instrument for evil, and well, the thing is that being non-local, when we see the evil out there, it's similar to like when we see somebody being unconscious. You can't see somebody being unconscious without having it trigger your own unconscious. It's a non-local phenomena. And the same thing with evil. When you see it out there, it's going to trigger your own self-righteousness or your own reactivity, and that's the evil. That's the evil that's playing out inside of you. And
Right.
if you just keep it outside of yourself, then you are unwittingly becoming an instrument of evil, all the while you're thinking you're doing good. So the point is that when you see it out there, the evil, and you see what's being triggered in yourself, and you actually tend to that, that's the way to deal with the evil, because then you find, the source of it is within myself. It's not just my personal psyche, but in the collective psyche, there exists what's called evil, and as we actually can own it and see that it's in us, but it's not like that it's mine in a sense that I own it, but it's something I have to take responsibility for. Each one of us doing that is lightening the shadow in the greater body politic.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So see, here's what we're really saying, folks, as you tune in. You may be a George W. Bush fan, but we're literally saying that there's a possibility that he is the Messiah that can help lighten the world.
Totally, no.
He may not like the way he's doing it, but for crying out loud, it's possible.
Yeah. In my book, I say he might be the highest level bodhisattva because he's helping to wake us up.
It just depends on how we look at it. I know it was funny because the other day I was talking about the other book by Vince Bugliosi, and it was funny because who I was talking to, I didn't know at the time, happened to be a resident of the state of Texas. But what was interesting was his reaction, sort of, not this crap again. How many times are they going to beat up on this guy? You could just sort of see that in his immediate reaction. So, he immediately began to slowly but surely sort of defend Bush for what he was doing. And I thought, well, that's fair enough. He believes in what George is doing. It's not up to me to say, well, I can prove otherwise through somebody's book. He actually said that George W. Bush was a fine, honest governor of the state of Texas. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting for me is that I didn't take a position, as you might think one would, to say, well, how's that possible? I mean, look what he's done to our country as the country's leader. What I thought was, well, how would I know whether he was a fine governor or not, because I don't live in the state of Texas? To take a position like that and say, I'm more open to what he has to say about this guy because he's had more direct experience than I have, so to speak.
The thing I just want to point about that, when somebody is actually possessed by malignant egophrenia, it's like it's an archetypal energy that actually they're channeling. They're, in a way, forfeiting their humanity, and they're plugging into the transpersonal energy, which is beyond the personal. And because of that, there's a certain charisma that comes through them that's very easily able to entrance other people through their blind spot, through their unconsciousness. So when somebody has malignant egophrenia like Bush and other people support him, there's a certain bubble that gets created that's impenetrable for any sort of reflective awareness. And on the contrary, anybody who's reflecting something that of their unconsciousness, of Bush's unconsciousness or of his supporters' unconsciousness, they'll be seen as the demon, they'll be seen as a threat, and they'll be seen as the one who's crazy. But the point is that it's important, and I talk about this in my book, to actually see like this field that gets conjured up with reference to like around Bush and his supporters, that actually it's like a spell that's being cast, and if you don't see it, it's really easy to fall asleep and to become part of the herd and part of like sheep who just follow the leader. But the whole origin of the process of all of these millions of people, whether it be the religious right or the Republicans who were following Bush, who's completely mad. I mean, just think about that. There are millions of people in our country who are following a complete madman. What I'm saying is that the origin of that process is to be found in the human psyche.
Mm-hmm. And, to me it seems to make a whole lot of sense, too. And again, when you can see this, that you can clearly understand that it's not about finger pointing towards somebody who is evil or doing evil, but it's a matter of taking a look and saying, well, what is my reaction inside, whether it's good or not? Do I believe in what he's doing? But then you take a look at the outcome. Well, I don't know if I could go and do that, for instance. Or I don't believe in what he is doing because you might be looking inside of yourself and saying, why can't I get away with that? It's really uniquely simple to see what you can do.
Right, no, totally. And for any of us to do work on ourselves, like an example being if somebody sees Bush and they concretize him as being evil and they demonize him, they're actually doing the very thing they're reacting to in Bush. In other words, they're projecting the shadow on Bush, which ultimately is the very thing that Bush is doing, and that's to actually be unwittingly feeding the pathology of malignant egophrenia. But that's different than saying, what Bush is doing, he's just, by being so asleep, he's actually an instrument for evil. So he himself is not evil, but he's an instrument for evil to incarnate itself into our world, into our third dimension. That's different than demonizing him. And what I'm saying is that the origin of those two things, it actually really determines, it's an expression of our state of consciousness, and it determines whether we're unwittingly feeding the pathology that we're wanting to cure or whether we're being a positive bodhisattvic agent of change. But it's radically important because I catch myself sometimes just like solidifying Bush and demonizing him, and then if I'm fortunate, I'll catch myself and I'll realize, I'm actually guilty in this moment of doing the very thing. And like think about it, the typical political activists, they can be very well-intentioned and very good people, but if they're coming from anger and if they're coming from the point of view of Bush being separate from themselves, and if they're demonizing Bush, they're actually an agent of the dark, all the while thinking they're serving the light. And it's important. You see, it's important to illumine the nature of the beast we're dealing with, and that's why in my book I have a chapter called "Shedding Light on Evil," because to the extent that people who are just like, I don't want to even have to think about it, to think about evil, it's not real. I don't want to have to like talk about it or anything like that. By them avoiding it, that's the way evil is then co-opting them to become an instrument for its incarnation. So it's important for us to actually really illumine the shadow that's playing out both individually inside of ourselves and collectively on the world stage.
Mm-hmm. I know one thing as I was talking about Vince's book earlier, as you can tell, he just don't like him. And I'm thinking, okay, I get it.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a fascinating conversation, and one thing that is wonderful, at least about our U.S. Constitution, is the fact that we created what's called a democracy, and for a democracy to survive and thrive, there has to be the ongoing debate. And throughout that debate, that's where you get to understand yourself and your position and say, well, does it serve? And if it does, how is it serving and what is its outcome? And ultimately, you begin to understand that just through that simple line of questioning, you realize, I have taken the steps, I have chosen to do this, and this is the possible outcomes, and I take responsibility for that. And it seems to me like a very simple solution, but a very long process, because when you take a look at this, this isn't a phenomenon, the madness of George W. Bush that's happening right now. This kind of madness, just as you said, goes back as far as the Egyptians when they were building the pyramids. It
totally.
goes back even further than that when you had indigenous tribes invading other tribes. You just had this going on, and they thought what they were doing is the right thing, while the receiving tribe is going, are you guys out of your mind? We were just minding our own business. Well,
right.
What's up? So it's been going back that far. So it's sort of like that encoded gene that deep inside of us, we just have to understand that we perpetrate our own outcomes. And the sooner we can take responsibility regardless of the outcome, the more accelerated that point two piece can become.
Sure, and just the final thing for me is that, when somebody has the realization of what I'm talking about in the book, then the result of that is compassion. But compassion, in Buddhism, they make the differentiation between having idiot compassion and having genuine compassion. Because compassion isn't necessarily smiley-faced and patting on the back type of thing. Sometimes it can be fierce, and it can say no, and it can set a boundary, and it can speak truth to power. That also is a part of real, genuine compassion.
Fascinating stuff, Paul, and I definitely want to commend you on at least taking a stab at a situation that everybody either wants to take a position, well, he's right or he's wrong, and I can't believe this, so let's get somebody else in this office to maybe change things. But whoever it may be, one way or the other, there's still a tremendous, almost awesome amount of work that needs to be done, especially for our own spiritual development, so that perhaps we do move away from madness happening. I don't know, maybe there's just that special gene in us, and that's what keeps us perpetuating forward, but it is possible. And Paul, we'd like to thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Yeah, it's been totally fun, Daniel. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Again, the book is simply titled The Madness of George W. Bush. Take a look at it, because it's about personal responsibility. You can't just be pointing that one finger out there on the problem. You have to understand, as a teacher once told me, that once you point your one finger towards something as blame, realize that you've got three fingers pointing back at you, so you're three times just as responsible for the outcome as that outcome is, whatever it may be. Hopefully that made sense to you. I want to thank Paul Levy for joining us here on the program today. Again, the title of his book is simply titled The Madness of George W. Bush, and we'll be putting that into our newsletter and shooting that out to our listeners as well. And also, I encourage the listeners out there to please log on to our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50 with a 50, beyond50radio.com, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter where you can find out more about the wonderful topics and programs that we have. Also want to send out a special thanks to HemiSync, one of the sponsors of the Beyond 50 radio program. And just to give you an idea what they do is they help people actually learn how they can tap into more of your brain's innate abilities, enter meditative states reliably and easily. You can reduce stress, be more creative and productive, concentrate and focus your attention when needed, experience deep restorative sleep and refreshing cat naps, or uncover your intuitive talents. That'd be a good way to remove the madness that we seem to be suffering from now. You can do this and a lot more with the aid of HemiSync's audio CDs. They've been refined with over 50 years of research and development and supported by numerous independent studies, reports, and articles. The patented HemiSync technology has been scientifically and clinically proven to be effective. Visit the Monroe Products website at www.hemi-sync.com. That's www.hemi-sync.com, or call 1-800-541-2488. That's 1-800-541-2488 to learn how this exceptional technology can help you achieve your greatest potential. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.